going live, and welcome to everyone in our virtual hangout. Let's start with some on-site people and introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Sundi Richards, and I'm an instructional designer here at St. Norbert, where T3 is happening, and it's been a fun day.
I'm Dave Cormier. I come from Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island.
I'm Bonnie Stewart. I also come from Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, and I'm excited to be in Wisconsin again.
Autumm Caines.
No other
I live on the internet.
And I'm Helen DeWaard. I work with Lakehead University in Central Ontario. So welcome to all of our virtual participants. We'll just get you to introduce yourselves and where you're hanging your hat these days.
I'll start. I'm Susan Adams from Oregon Health and Science University in Portland, Oregon.
Hi, Susan.
Hi, Bonnie.
And I'm Stephanie Loomis, and I am at Georgia State University in Atlanta.
Hi, Stephanie.
And I get to go to Prince Edward Island next month.
Oh, that's great.
DigPed PEI, July 13th to 15th. Very excited. Other people might want to come.
That's true.
We still have a couple of spaces.
Hi, I'm Brittany Brown O'Donnell, and I'm at Virginia Tech. I'm currently a doc student.
Hi, Brittany. This is my first time actually seeing your face move outside of your little Twitter avatar.
And I'm Rebecca Hogue, co-founder of Virtually Connecting, and I'm joining you from Sunnyvale, California.
Hi, Rebecca.
So we'll just kick off, and we'd like to hear about the conference a little bit, about the sessions. Some of us were able to watch the live stream this morning of Bonnie and Dave's presentation, and some of us were able to watch the presentation that Autumm did kind of in the mid of the day. So just give us an idea of what's going on in the conference and conversations that you've talked about, and then our virtual people can join in and ask some questions.
So I'll start off because I haven't seen these people except for barely at lunch since the keynote. So I'm actually curious what's been going on for everybody else. It's a tiny conference, but there's a lot of sessions going on. The keynote was awesome this morning in starting the conversations. It was really nice in pushing the kind of conversations in the direction that I personally want to be a part of and want to talk about. So maybe I'm just speaking from my own experience, but I've heard other people saying similar things. And it
bless you for saying so.
But it really, yeah. I was scared about my session. I'm talking about a project I'm doing that isn't really in the open and isn't necessarily a lot of participatory things that were talked about this morning. However, you know, it brought out those parts in it, or what it could be, or a different conversation that I've had before. So that was awesome for me. So, and then the last session I went to was two folk from UW Green Bay. So this is also bringing in, you know, schools that are closer together but don't talk to each other. But they came in, Chuck Rybuck and Rebecca Nesbet, talking about some open projects they do, which are really awesome. So I'm obviously really excited. That was my experience.
My experience was that this is an incredible place to do a keynote. Beautiful, beautiful space here. Really, really exciting to be here. And then the session I was just in, actually, I think it's my fault that we started a couple of minutes late. I apologize. I was downstairs.
Say it isn't so.
I know. This is very rare, okay? I am a timely person. However, I was just chairing a session. There were two faculty members here at St. Norbert, one of whom is a biblical scholar who uses Twitter primarily for research and, again, to connect with people outside of his small college, because there's no one else here who does the things that he does. And so he uses this for, uses Twitter for its incredible professional development kind of capacity, right? To get him into the conversations that he wants to be in that aren't necessarily always local. And then there's another person here who is, I believe, the head of the art gallery. Is that correct?
Yeah, she runs the art gallery,
so
and
she
also
runs,
teaches.
She runs the art gallery, and thanks to Daniel and Sundi, she actually just started using Twitter a couple of months ago as part of the #Museum Week to share what the art gallery does. She did a fabulous, and of course, image-wise, beautiful presentation on how she's gotten going with that, what it's done for her, what she feels it can do for the gallery, where she'd like to go with it. And so afterwards, someone came up who does paleontology, and she said, I had never thought of myself using Twitter, and suddenly I kind of almost feel like I should, so I was just downstairs trying to get her set up with an account so that our 10-year-old who loves paleontology can follow her. She's off to Ireland next week for a dig. So it was just really exciting to kind of get on the ground and talk with people about things that they are actually trying, that they do, or that they might want to try.
So I was in a fairly specific session about sort of open research using Zotero to help cultivate collaborative work among students. And one of the things that I'm going to really take away is this guy. I don't know if you can see that. His name is Jay Kurchak. I follow him on Twitter now. He was talking about one of the assignments that he does in his class and the way he does first-year writing for science students, which is one of those things that is a total challenge to try to figure out how do you work out writing so that first-year science students both understand the academic process of writing, but also the knowledge translation piece that makes that viable for other people to understand and engage with it. So what he does is his midterm assignment is essentially a BuzzFeed listicle that they have to do for the research that they're doing, and he has those post those publicly, and they go on the Facebook, and the sort of challenge is to get as many. He does a Tumblr as well. Yeah. As many of your friends, like non-science friends or whatever friends as possible, will reshare it and like it as you possibly can, and that's sort of the challenge that they have there. And then he does a traditional academic sort of science paper at the end, and I think there's something wonderful about the design of that because it forces them both to dig deeper into what their understanding of the science to be able to explain to somebody else, but also gives them a sense of the balance between the two and how public science, which is something that I feel really passionate about, is something that can indelibly be part of the creation process for any kind of scientific endeavor. And I thought that he had a really nice project that he's running at whatever institution he is at, which is not on his.
I think he might be here.
He's here.
Engaged Brain.
It says Haverford, Pennsylvania, so probably not here.
Oh, he actually switched. I met him this morning, and he just got a job
at some institution. Anyway, he is at engagedbrains.tumblr.com.
Yeah.
His wife works here.
One of the things that I loved about what he was doing as well is, to me, he's talking about the importance of public communication of, academic knowledge. In the process, he's teaching his students by getting them to do that public communication. He's teaching them media logics, and he's hopefully giving them exposure to critical thinking about the media literacy of telling the difference between an academic article and a public article. Because I have, I find that often, even at a master's level, it can be really difficult for students to make the distinction about the boundaries of knowledge and in those two fields, in those two areas. And so you'll get, someone for a thesis is still trying to use essentially a BuzzFeed article, not to say this is being talked about, which is perfectly fine in a thesis, but actually as sort of instead of peer-reviewed knowledge. And so getting people to engage in the knowledge production of those things helps make it clearer.
Bonnie, I have a question for you about that.
Sure.
Do you have either a matrix or a rubric for helping students distinguish between sort of that boundary of knowledge, like what's public and what's not? My faculty were asking for that this morning, and I've thought of it as an intuitive thing and a process of learning over time, but wondering if there are any assets to share to help students think through that.
I don't have any, and I'm actually just realizing that I need one.
We need to create one.
I'm working with a thesis student for the first time, and so that is a whole new process of supervision or co-supervision, and particularly important there for me to be able to make explicit things that have always kind of been implicit for me. My dissertation was on Twitter. I used a lot of media pieces, but I used them in specific ways, and I realize now that that just isn't necessarily something that is explicit for everybody about how you can use certain types of knowledge. But I have not yet looked for, if anybody knows of it, please at me, let me know.
Yeah, I think that's one of the barriers that I'm seeing as I slowly get faculty to consider this in the classroom, is they want to give their students, everything that they need, and they're sort of nervous about, what are they going to find, and wanting to help them consider what that could be. And I've been trying to encourage them to let it be discoverable, not necessarily have to have a writer or rhyme to these things. But
Hey, Susan.
Discover.
I'm going to let you continue in just a second, but your voice broke up pretty bad there. You know how Hangouts does that thing where it makes you sound like a robot? Sometimes if you just stop talking for a second and then start talking again, it'll fix itself.
Okay.
There you go.
Actually, you were growling.
You were.
It was very impressive.
I actually think I might let go of my comment. It was just more of a comment than a question. So let's keep the conversation going with some questions.
Any questions?
I actually, my only question is, does anybody have what Susan was asking for? Because I'd love to have it too.
Can we create it?
Yeah, maybe we should create it. I mean, that
swarm
might
it.
be an interesting sort of Google Doc to put together.
Maybe as a
For all of us.
project for a PEI session or something.
Exactly.
Oh, is there
Sounds
something on PEI?
I think there might be something going on.
I
at
heard there
PEI in
was
just a
something
couple
going
of
on at
weeks.
PEI.
Yeah. I think that would be a great collaborative Google Doc kind of thingy. We should VC something around it or something.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it could be a virtually connecting session at PEI. How many of you guys got to watch the keynote and participate on Twitter and all of that? How was the virtual experience been?
Do you know at the beginning it was difficult to get connected, but once once things started working, it was actually pretty good, but really cool to watch the side conversations happening on Twitter as well, and the random sharing of colors was also kind of fun.
Did you know that they did the color?
I heard that.
Yeah,
I was told.
on Twitter. It was
So
great.
which one of us was better? That's the real question.
Oh!
I always lose this game, so it's a pretty easy question.
Yeah.
Everybody's going to say Bonnie.
Only because I'm nicer to them.
That's fair.
It's fair. Well, I was actually worried about sound because we didn't have mics, but I was hoping that the sound came through. So it's always interesting to remember that you're not mic'd in a big room, and I think both of us have a habit of pacing and walking a little bit away from the front. So apologies if the sound wasn't optimal, but
It must have felt like preaching to the choir.
there was a moment where I got up at the beginning and I stood on the steps and I said, okay, suddenly like my childhood spent in church is all coming flooding back to me. The temptation to open my arms and welcome everybody in big preacherly tones was quite high, but I did manage to restrain myself from passing a hat or anything like that.
I thought it was kind of interesting that this is a pretty small conference. I mean, at the keynote there was probably 45 people, maybe 40. But because of who you guys are and who your networks are, there was probably a more active Twitter feed than at some of the huge keynotes I've been at, with like 200 people in the room, right? And probably a little more, talking back and forth to each other. So that was interesting.
Because we have great friends.
Really?
So thanks
So
for
I have a
lighting up
question.
the T3 channel.
I have a question for Dave. During your session, you were surprised to find someone in the audience who had experience with learning contracts.
Mm-hmm.
How frequently do you find other people in higher ed using or dabbling or toying with learning contracts in their classes?
Well, I know that when I started looking for them after my student, I had a conversation with a student, I don't know what that was, 7 or 8 years ago. There was not a lot out there. It just so happens that Kathy Davidson had flirted with them about 6 months before. So Kathy Davidson from, where's she now?
She's at CUNY now.
She's at CUNY now. So there was that stuff out there. But from what I've seen, I get a lot of blank looks. I mean, people understand what it means based on what the words are when you put them together. But in terms of actually having a learning contract, and I don't even go all the way. I don't do the signature. Like some people go the whole way and have like a signed place where people sign them off and that kind of stuff. And I think of that as just a little bit more dramatic than what I need for what I'm trying to get done. But very rarely. Every once I was at one conference. Now try to remember which conference it was. I was at one conference where there was a pack of people who Maybe it was a learning design conference I was at. That would make sense. But other than that, almost never.
Susan just mentioned people have sometimes called the syllabus a learning contract. I find that interesting because generally, unless the syllabus is negotiated, it's a pretty one-way contract.
Right.
Here's a contract, please.
There's
something there that certainly reinforces the teacher-centered nature of education as a system. I mean, I do see my syllabus as essentially the sort of social contract that I'm trying to set out in terms of what they can expect from me and what they can expect to look at content-wise. But going that step further to get students to give them the decision of how much do you choose to engage with, what are you aiming for here, how much will you complete, particularly given that you teach in adult ed, right, and that fits the adult ed learning principles, is a really nice fit.
I've taken a fair amount of critique, actually, for how not flexible my learning contract is. So Stephen Downs has taken me to issue a couple of times about the fact that I start with a draft. So what I do is the vast majority of my students have no idea what I'm talking about when I start out, and I get them the first day, and we're like, oh, okay, so there's going to be a learning contract, and my students are educators of some sort, if not traditional educators necessarily. And there's a fair amount of resistance, and I tried one year to start from a blank piece of paper, and it was a total what's the word for that? That's a good word. It's more polite than the one that was in my head.
The other thing is you tend to teach that course in a condensed period of time, so you've only got so much time to negotiate the contract that is actually only a part of the learning itself, right? Of the things that you are contractually obliged to do.
So I tend to structure a certain amount of it and give people a lot of choice inside of it. And actually, the last time I did it, if you go to ed366.com, in the menu on the bottom right-hand side, it says course contract. If you click on that button, you'll see the Google Doc I used the last time I taught this course. And on the side are the comments from the students, because I sent it out to them and gave them a chance to feed back on the doc, on the contract itself. So instead of having an individual discussion with each student about the structure of the course contract, which is not really fair, because for the most part they'd never seen one before. So sitting down with a student in a power position and having an authentic conversation about a learning contract when they've never seen one and you've spent 5 years designing one, it's not exactly an equitable power situation. So what I do with that class is, and I'll probably do it this summer when I teach it again, is say, here's the learning contract as it's designed. I'll send it out to them before they come to class, ask them the feedback on Google. Most of them won't. We'll sit down and say, okay, let's talk about what this means. Read it tonight, comment on it again, and then hopefully they'll have some sense. But it's not, it always ends up being a little unfair because the learning contract makes sense when people understand, any contract only makes sense when people understand the power position they're coming in from. And it's an unequitable power position to begin with. I mean, I'm the teacher, I get control over grades and all the rest of this stuff, and hopefully I give them some of that power back inside the contract. But if you've never been part of the negotiation of that kind of contract, it's a pretty intimidating process, and they don't believe me. They really don't believe that I'm actually willing to let them pick their final grade. So that's also, anyway.
There's a whole unlearning process that almost needs to precede that.
Yeah. Suzanne Morelli joined us late, and she didn't get a chance to introduce herself. Do we want to let Suzanne introduce herself?
Nope.
Can't hear you. Suzanne, we can't hear you.
Yeah, because I'm muted.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
That would explain it.
Figured it out. Hi.
Hi.
I have a wrong link or something.
Do you just want to give a quick introduction?
You.
All right.
Suzanne, where are you?
I can't seem to unmute this.
You did. Oh. You're good. We can hear you.
Okay. I teach at Capital University where Autumm works.
Oh, great.
In political science.
Excellent. Well, welcome to the conversation.
Yes, I enjoyed what I heard this morning and glad to have all the published stuff. That's what I'm sort of used to. So I'm interested in this conversation. I've only been in and out of it a little bit. I think the biggest challenge, is dealing with all the different kinds of learners. So that's been true before technology. So
right, yeah.
I mean, what I'm finding at this conference and so many conferences, no matter the scale, right, is you've got a campus of people trying to do things. Everybody is coming from different disciplines, have students with different learning needs, etc., and trying to figure out ways to make the best use of technology where relevant, but to really do good learning. And that's sort of the big core. And I found that there's real engagement here. This seems like a pretty lively little place to be.
Well, that's one thing about a small conference, right? You get the people that actually really want to be there, and so some of that comes out. In terms of, I just heard two really cool ways of approaching the types of different learners in the last session I was in, just addressing what you were bringing up, in that, so Chuck Ryback does some projects with his literature course, and the students all read the same book, but they all do different digital projects. So not everybody's doing the same thing. So everyone finds a kind of, like one of the projects is there's a Twitter group, and as they're having a class discussion, the Twitter group just tweets the discussion so that they have a record of the talk. So it's a nice approach to kind of those different types of learners. So
I've done that with giving each person who does a presentation as a critical friend who's responsible for not only keeping track of what's said, but also gathering the comments during that person's presentation and curating the responses, and then presenting that curated response back to the person who's presenting, so that they become like the buddy for that presentation that's responsible for, it just it gives them that other set of literacies, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I did something a few years back with a communications class of mine of B.Ed students, so people in pre-service teaching, and I had been invited to speak to Radio EduTalk in Scotland, and I figured, why not use this as kind of like the closing sort of end of term piece for my students and get them to speak to Radio EduTalk in Scotland, because they're all teachers in a place that wasn't doing a lot of hiring teachers, so I thought it might be a good connection for them. And so what we did was we divided the group. They could self-select into 4 different categories. The people who would do 10 minutes of prepared sharing around the network learning stuff that we'd done that term. The people who would answer questions live. They didn't have to prepare, but they had to be willing to speak off the cuff. The people who would live tweet all of the discussion publicly, and then the people who would use Etherpad to make a much more formal but less sort of public, for their names, identities, record of the stuff that we did, so that everybody could make some choices around identity and the types of engagement that they were comfortable with.
You had this collection of...
there were a variety of roles for them to take up, but all of them were related to some form of many-to-many communications, because that was really the whole point of it. And there was an interesting point this morning that always comes up. Students, in many ways, have been acculturated to want to sit and learn and take notes and take a test. And so this was not everybody's favorite assignment. Some of them loved it. Some of them, were really, really positive about it. Some of them, frankly, I think quite resented having to do something like this that was so out of their comfort zone. But I teach teachers. These are the people who will be teaching my kids. I don't want my kids to be taught by people who haven't been forced to grapple to some extent, and given the opportunity to unlearn some of staying in that comfort zone. And so I felt like it was my job to give them hands-on opportunities to try new things that were scaffolded and safe, where they couldn't fail. Because once they get out and have a classroom of their own, those pressures, they're not going to start taking those risks then, right?
That's for sure.
Anybody?
Okay, there we go. Oh, Susan, were you going to say something?
No, go for it. Go for it.
I just noticed on the Twitter stream there was some conversation about synchronous and async, and I was just wondering if anybody there was part of any of that conversation somewhere, if any of you guys were part of it.
In what context, Rebecca?
Yeah.
It was a presentation. It was one of the presentations that was going on. Somebody tweeted something about synchronous in the online classroom or something, in a blended classroom, and student perceptions.
I would have loved to have seen that. No, I wasn't, because I was just chairing a session last, so I missed that one. I always find it really interesting. I tend to really like what asynchronous communications allows, even as a supplement to face-to-face classes. So I haven't taught a course without, by my own choice, Moodle component for more than 10 years now, simply because I want there to be some of the things that come out in online discussions as well as what comes out in face-to-face discussions, because they do tend to sometimes be slightly different things. But the synchronous pieces are the pieces that sometimes I use them, sometimes I don't. It just depends on the nature of the class. If we aren't meeting face-to-face, I tend to prioritize the synchronous pieces more, simply because I think there is something important to kind of being there together, even if it's an online togetherness. So this past term I had a totally online class, and Sundi actually came in from St. Norbert to speak to my class about some things. And I had a number of other guest speakers who joined us throughout the term, so we could have this sort of sense of belonging and togetherness.
Someone was just speaking here about teaching their first online course, and it's day 2 for him. And he's taught hybrid, but this is his first online, and he's like, I can feel the space for me, I can feel the presence for me. I just don't know where any of the students are. And he's feeling that, like, whoa, what is that space? Yeah. And I think the synchronous helps develop the sense of your students as well, which obviously is important. Or students. That was another thing that was brought up in the last session. Not my students or our students, but students.
I think there's nothing more eerie than that first week of class as a teacher online, when you put things out there and you're just waiting for students to start coming into the space, right? You don't know that they're reading all of the background information and getting ready to make their first post. Until that post is there, you have no idea, and it's really a difficult space to be in as a professor.
Yeah, I've been spending the last year mulling over the idea of the asynchronous course hour around this, and lots of people heard me blab about this before.
Oh yeah, we've talked about that at DLARN.
Yeah, it's a mess, right? Because if you have a new faculty, somebody who's teaching for the first time, and let's say, I always think of change as 20-60-20, and let's assume they're not the 20% of people who work 100 hours a week and whatever else. There's somebody who cares about their job, wants to do a good job, is willing to go online, but wasn't part of that group that's been trying to pick at it for the last 20 years. They're a good faculty member who's trying to do their job right. And if they say to you, what does it mean for me to do the appropriate amount of work to teach online, right? And I want to be able to answer that question for people, because increasingly I'm starting to think it's a big issue, because, you know, everybody knows that if you have 3 hours a week that you teach in a face-to-face classroom, showing up to those 3 hours a week is what you're supposed to do. Now, it sounds silly to say that out loud, but once you move online, how do you translate that time? And our faculty contracts say, and I mean, we're all, I think, I started this with Kate, but I know lots and lots of people talk about this. We need to be equitable to the faculty as well in terms of the amount of time that they spend on this, right? So what does it mean to do your job properly in an online course, and what's ridiculous for the amount of work that you're doing? And I think that idea, how do you translate that faculty contract, 3 hours of contact per week, into the online space, is one of those answers that, from what I've seen in the literature, there is no answer out there that anybody feels comfortable with. People say stuff like, well, the same amount of work you do in a face-to-face classroom, which is a ridiculous answer. But it's the one we have.
Well, I mean, it's already bled in the sense that even face-to-face classes, there were always office hours in addition to your in-class time. But now there is also email, right? And that can be a lot or a little, but if you start getting 10 of the same emails, then you can go to the next class, if you have a face-to-face class, and say to everybody, okay,
enough.
Tenia's asked me the same question, so here's the answer.
And I told you last time.
But if you don't have a face-to-face class, and particularly if you don't have an asynchronous time that's coming up soon, then you have to respond to each of those 10 emails individually. Or maybe they're not exactly the same questions, so you have to write 10 individual responses, right? Even that kind of time bleeds excessively. Then you have the whole question of, well, you got to talk at people for 3 hours synchronously online. That doesn't seem like a really good form of communication.
Just record it as a video.
I don't think we've given a lot of thought to actually how communications formats structure our teaching. And so even that idea, that's why I end up talking so much about many-to-many. I think many-to-many is a really important concept that once I got it, I understood student-centered learning. It doesn't mean that I always want to be doing many-to-many, because sometimes I don't want to write 10 emails explaining the same thing.
Sometimes
so I want it to be,
talk.
sometimes I just want to hear myself talk. I don't know why you would say that.
I can't imagine.
Can't imagine. But sometimes there needs to be, the key messages that you've got to get out. Sometimes you do have content that is important for students to hear. And so even when I'm talking about many-to-many in education, I'm not saying it's the only form of communication we need to be engaging in. I think we need to be much more clear with our students about, here's something that I need to get through to you, and then here's a time when we're going to actually break it up, and I actually do want you folks to engage with each other. And how we do that online adds whole other sort of uncomfortable zones for people as well. But I'm not sure it's totally about online. I think some of it's actually about forms of communication.
And how different they can be, so how can you,
how much time's engaged?
Well, the technology comes into it when the technology impacts what is capable, right? What does this particular technology afford? Then we get into this whole idea of technology affordances.
Yep.
I also think that the important piece there for faculty health is that 3 hours chunked up in 4 minutes of time, like the emails you're describing, should not really be equated to 3 hours spent done in a row. Because the cognitive load of taking on 74-minute chunks is just not equivalent to what it is to do 280 minutes of straight lecturing. The straight lecture is tough and it's a lot of work and whatever, but it's just not the same thing, and that's where all this stuff ends up being difficult. So I ran the first online course I ever taught, or not, there's a blended course I ever taught where, and I've said this, told this story lots, but I can't keep track of student papers, particularly in lots and lots of them. And I was doing a writing course, and this is years ago, and I had some students that had 150, 170, 180 submissions on the discussion board, and that was great, but am I really going to read 180? Hey, Jimmy, that's a really great comment you just made about Janie's work. Wow, that's really nice. And grade them? Well, no. So then how do you sift through that? I don't think we've gotten to the point where we have an effective way, and you were talking about rubrics to help people understand stuff earlier, to explain to that 60%, that middle group of faculty who are just trying to do their job well, where the boundaries are, right? Where does healthy live?
Yeah, and also it can be important to have your students be an audience for each other. You don't have to be, if you're really going to do something that decenters you in some way, you can't be the audience for every single thing the students say either. And they've got to understand how to prioritize their communications just like you do. But it's complex, and it's usually meta learning to a course that's actually about something completely other. Sorry, Susan, go ahead. Or whoever.
Well, I was going to jump in because that concept of many-to-many really emphasizes the fact that the course is about the student engagement with each other, not just with me or the content. You hinted at that this morning in the keynote, the presences that you referred to. And that's a challenge, I think, in online courses to structure that within the design of the course. How do you or Dave talk about building the course design with that in mind?
For me, it always depends on what I'm teaching. So I saw Rebecca had posted just a few minutes ago too, like how do you use conversations to support learning? It depends on, and I always teach now in education. I did used to teach academic writing, but those are my areas. So I don't teach chemistry where there is sort of and that is probably as it should be and as was intended by the maker of the universe. But I don't teach courses with sort of a foundational knowledge that you have to do step 2, right? I teach teachers who already have experience with school, even if they are on day one of being a pre-service teacher. They've all been through at least 16 previous years of education, or have been, in some cases, homeschooled or unschooled, but that's pretty rare, actually, for the people that we get. So I'm often getting people to unpack their own implicit knowledge. It is easier for me to do that type of work than it might be if I were teaching more foundational courses. The course description that I've got still determines to some extent what they do. So I teach a technologies course to master's students, and I teach the course called the Adult Learner to college instructors who are mostly coming out of industry, have never taught before, and are experts in welding or construction, and sometimes actually have some pretty negative experiences with their own formal education, and suddenly are coming in to be the instructor of courses. And so we do very different types of many-to-many exercises, just depending on where people are coming from and starting from. But part of it is giving them permission to engage as knowers. Part of it is me getting out of the way and shutting up long enough for them to have the chance. Because there's, whether face-to-face or online, there's always those kind of quiet moments at first where no one's sure if they want to jump in.
I'll say in response that I'll take a different angle. I do it very, very differently online than I do it face-to-face. So face-to-face, when I want to give people a chance to sort of have a different sort of experience, I can insert myself as a human in a way to support the emotional challenges that go along with uncertainty in ways that I simply cannot do online. So I can be a lot more quote-unquote courageous with the course face-to-face because I can see people falling apart and I can step in to hopefully help them when that's happening. Whereas I find online the times where I've tried to be, as another word for courageous there would be aggressive, in the deconstruction process of learning, the unlearning, as Bonnie called it earlier, it doesn't work as well. And again, I also say that the audience is we did this, George Siemens and I taught an online course in 2010 to a group of people from a culture that does not, that has a more indelible connection to the idea of hierarchy, let's just put it that way. And for them, the idea of that same kind of deconstructed course was absolutely impossible. It wasn't there because it was online. I think if we'd had them face to face, we would have had a shot at sort of making the peripheral. What is the early set Vygotsky thing? The peripheral zone of proximal. I think we could have done the zone of proximal development face to face. Like we could have found the other thing that they did that was like that and said, look, you do this in your life. It's more like this. Don't think of it like you do learning normally, but think of it like you play soccer or whatever it would have been. But online, it was very, very difficult to find that proximal zone where they understood the idea of confronting uncertainty, where they understood those concepts, and it was a total failure. So I think the audience there is really important, and also the mode makes a big difference as well.
Daniel's here.
Nice shirt.
Thank you.
Look at these shirts.
Stylish man.
Very cool.
Daniel was pretty instrumental in getting this conference together. Did you want to talk to us a little bit? How did it go for you?
How do you feel about this conference?
How do you feel about it?
I feel awesome. I just came from 2 amazing sessions in a row. And the first one was called, Dave is taking over my identity again. I don't want to be Dave. I don't want to be Dave.
No.
Nobody wants to be Dave. I just came from a session called Thus Tweets Academia, and then after that there was one called, actually I forget what the session was called, but it was from a theater prof here who taught a fully online course in the history of clothing.
Oh, cool.
And it was so great. Like what she did was so great. She sent out a box of sample different types of fabric, and she had the students analyze and try and like dissect and figure out where the fabric came from and how old it was and what kind of there was different kinds of fur and stuff, and just like I don't know. I don't have the words right now. I'm feeling all like flushed.
But you had the best words.
I have the best words. No, it was a really, it was a really great conference. I think it was my first time organizing it. The third time it's happened here at St. Norbert, and I think next year we're probably going to try and have a multi-site one. So there will be a site here and then one in one of another school, probably in Illinois, which we'll probably be talking about at the reception in about 14 minutes, I think. So, yeah. But yeah, it's been good, and I think it was interesting because last year the conference only had people from 3 different colleges, but this time around there were 10 different institutions. So a lot more different types of voices, I guess.
And you guys had an international
keynote.
A large virtual presence.
Large virtual presence. And actually, here's a cool thing, quickly. Hashtag T3Blaze was trending #2 locally here for the last couple hours. Yeah, so that's kind of weird.
That's really
kind of
exciting.
cool.
That's you guys.
Excellent, with the VC connection.
Yeah.
So we are coming up on an hour here. I guess I just want to, we're probably going to want to go to the reception here. Is there any other questions or anything for us?
Nope, just very happy to have had a chance to meet all of you guys there and learn some of the transformative things that are happening. It was a very interesting day.
Great.
Great to see you guys, always.
Thanks.
Okay, so we'll say our goodbyes and we'll sign off.
Bye.
Bye.
Enjoy.
Bonnie and Sundi.